All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about histograms. Histograms is a type of graph that shows the frequency of data in intervals. So in the image here, you can see I have an example of a bar graph on the left and a histogram on the right. Histogram kind of sounds like Instagram, but they're actually not connected. Histogram's been around a lot longer. Okay, so anyways. The bar graph and the histogram are very similar to each other, but yet they have some important differences. As you can see, they're similar in that they both use bars. All right, the second way that they are similar is that they're both made using the X and the Y axis, okay? I drew them in here with my black line. X is that horizontal or side-to-side axis that we talked about, and then Y is the vertical axis that goes up and down. Okay, so that's how our two graphs are alike. Now, a histogram is different because, first of all, if you look on the x-axis, we have numbers. Typically, a bar graph won't use numbers, but instead it'll have categories as the data on the x-axis. Okay, our histogram is always going to have numbers. And it doesn't just have numbers, but oftentimes the numbers are going to be grouped together. So we have a range, or what we call an interval, for each bar. So this first bar on the histogram is going to represent from 1 to 5. So these are just kind of very general graphs. We don't know exactly what information they're showing us, but let's just say that the histogram is showing us maybe how many, I don't even know how many pets there are. Okay, so we could say that if we surveyed a whole bunch of people, there were over 20 families that had 1 to 5 pets. Okay, so that's a main difference for histograms. Histograms are going to have numbers on the x-axis, and the numbers are going to be grouped, or we call those intervals, or maybe a range of numbers. Okay, the second way that a histogram is different from a bar graph is that there is no space in between the bars, and that's because of those intervals that we just talked about. So where one bar stops, another bar is going to start up. Okay, now when we're talking about frequency, we said that a histogram shows the frequency of data in intervals. Frequency tells us how often something occurs. You know, like if I said I frequently go to Walmart, that means I go there often. And then frequency, we could also use that word to tell like specifically how many times something would happen. And that's what we have here. Okay, histograms are good to use whenever we have a large set of data. So we have a lot of pieces of data, and maybe also our numbers are big or really spread out. Let's go through making a histogram together. I think that'll help you to understand it a little bit more if you've actually made one yourself. So here we have a set of data that represents the number of minutes students spent on TikTok. Okay, you can see we've got quite a few pieces of data here. So first, we're going to actually organize our data into a frequency table, and then we'll be able to make our histogram real quick and easy from there. All right, so as we look at our data, we first want to start with finding the smallest number and the biggest number, or the least number of minutes spent on TikTok and the greatest amount of minutes. Okay, so I see right away that 99 is going to be the greatest amount of minutes that we have. Okay, and 52 is the least amount of minutes that we have. So our minutes are ranging from 52 to 99. So I'm going to round that and say we're going from about 50 to 100 minutes. Okay, now we want to take our range and split it into intervals or groups of numbers here. Okay, that's just going to make this a little bit easier. If we tried to graph every single piece of data, that's really a big range. It wouldn't make sense to make like a bar graph, or even if we tried to make a dot plot like we were talking about before, it wouldn't really make sense because we'd have a very long number line or a big range in our numbers, and they would be all spread out. there's not necessarily a lot of numbers that are repeating. So a histogram is going to be a nice way to help us organize this. Okay, so because my numbers go from 50 to 100, I'm going to separate those into intervals of about 10 numbers. That way, I just think that'll help this work out nicely. Okay, so my first interval, I'm going to say, will be from, let's do 50 to 59. Okay, so I know that some of you might say that's not 10 numbers, but it actually is. If you go through and count each individual number starting with 50 all the way up to 59, it is 10 numbers. Okay, and then your next interval would need to start with 60. You don't want to repeat any numbers. So we go 60 to 69, 70, to 79, 80 to 89, and then we have 90 to 99. Okay, this is one way that we could have done it. It also would be okay if we did 51 to 60, and then 61 to 70, 71 to 80, 81 to 90, 91 to 100. Okay, see how you could have shifted that just a little bit, and it would have still worked because it included our smallest number all the way to the largest. All right, now my middle column in my table is going to be just where I keep tally marks. So I'm going to go through my list of data, and I am just going to put a tally in the interval where it belongs. So 80 is going to fall in this interval. 68 will fall in this interval. Okay, you guys see what I'm going to do? So if you're doing this along with me, you can go ahead and pause and do that also. Okay, so you can see there, I went through and tallied up each one of those numbers, and then the frequency is just how often that occurs. So it's like your total, basically, for that interval. Okay, and then that is our frequency table. From there, we can come down here and make a histogram, and it should be pretty quick and easy. Okay, so our histogram is going to start with our X and our Y axis. Okay, so try to make it as neat as you can, your X and your Y axis. We're going to put our intervals, or the number of minutes, down here on the X axis. Okay, so we always want to make sure that we're labeling so we know what our X and our Y axis represent. So I'm going to put minutes down here, leave space for your numbers there right below the X axis, and then our Y axis is where we will put the frequency, and sometimes it will be labeled frequency. It could also, in this case, we could label it as number of students. Okay, so goodness, so either one is okay there. All right, then we want to get those intervals down here on the x-axis. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here for a moment. You want to try to keep them equal because your bar is going to be, remember, we won't have any space in between our bars. So I'm going to take the line that I have here and I'm going to try to split it as best I can into 5 equal parts. Okay, so I'm going to say about 1, 2, 3, 4, and that should take me to about right there. Okay, and then I'm going to label each one of those as the intervals that we've already created up there in our frequency table. Okay, so I have my intervals labeled. You want to make sure that you do that as well. And then on the y-axis, we need to look at our frequency column. Okay, frequency and number of students are the same, and you can see the highest number there was 10. So we need to label our y-axis to make sure that it goes up to at least 10. So just like when you're making a bar graph, you could count by 1s or you could count by 2s, or it wouldn't really be necessary to go by 5s or 10s because we're only going to 10. Okay, so now that we have our x and our y-axis labeled, then we're just going to go ahead and make the bars for the frequency like we accounted for in our frequency table. Make sure that you don't leave any space in between your bars. Okay, so you can see from 50 to 59, there were 4 students. So I put my bar up to the 4 and then start right there where that one ended. And there were 6 students that went 60 to 69 minutes. Okay, and we're just going to continue that through. All right, and there we have our histogram. So even though there weren't any students that spent 70 to 79 minutes on TikTok, we still need to include that interval. There's no bar for it, so we could say that's our gap in our data. All right, one last thing I want to do here. Let's take a look at a histogram that we didn't make and read it and gather some information from it. Okay, so this histogram is showing us the lengths of frog jumps, and we're measuring in centimeters. You can see on the x-axis, that's where the lengths are. You see the intervals of numbers are in groups of 50, and then we have the frequency, which would be like the number of frogs on the y-axis. Okay, so number 1, how many frogs jumped 51 to 100 centimeters? That would be the second bar here, which is between 4 and 6, so that would be 5 frogs. Okay, number 2, how many frogs jump more than 100 centimeters? So the second bar goes 51 to 100, so we aren't going to include that one, but we would include the third, the fourth, and the fifth bar. So we have 10 here, and there were 7 frogs here, and 1 frog here. So 10 plus 7 plus 1 would be 18 frogs. Okay, how many frogs were surveyed? Huh? You think they asked the frogs? So funny. Anyways, okay, so we already know that there were 18 in those 3 bars, so we could add 5 for this one and 2 for this one. So that would be a total of, very good, 25 frogs. All right, and number 4, what was the farthest a frog jumped? Aha, so this is where a histogram is not so good, because we don't know the answer to that question. Just by looking at this histogram, we don't know how far, we don't know the farthest a frog jumped. We know that it went somewhere from 201 to 250 centimeters, but we don't know exactly what the farthest jump was. It could have been 220 centimeters. It could have been 250 centimeters. It could have been 201.5 centimeters. Okay, so we just aren't sure. So that's the downfall. If you're just looking at the histogram, you can't really tell the exact pieces of data. We just kind of have that generalized number. We just know there was 1 frog that jumped from 201 to 250 centimeters. Okay, so that's a downfall. So be careful when you're answering questions looking at a histogram so that you're doing that accurately. Okay, all right. We'll see you later.